Chapter 9. In speaking of contemporary America, Gurdjieff sometimes made reference to the new American gods, the scientists, and more particularly the personal gods, doctors and psychiatrists. He seemed to feel that doctors were a dangerous breed for, even though they were often motivated by high-sounding principles, such as a dedication to saving the lives of people, they knew very little about humanity, almost nothing about the interrelation of the mind, the emotions, and the body, and that their aim was not generally to aid or save people, but simply to eradicate disease. He said that man was not only the chief, but perhaps the only organism that interfered constantly and radically with the balance of nature, a very dangerous activity under any circumstances, and particularly dangerous when men did not know what they were doing and did not even take nature into consideration. He said that nature was infinitely patient, constantly adapting herself to the strains imposed on her by these machinations of mankind, especially scientists, but he warned that nature would, in the long run, be forced to get even, as it were, and impose a proper balance and harmony on man. As to doctors and disease, it would not be correct to say that he was an advocate of euthanasia or that he thought that the prevention of disease was a bad aim, but there is no question but that the prolongation of human life under any and all circumstances and at any cost was, in his opinion, useless and objectively immoral. Each life had, according to him, a purpose and rhythm of its own, and it was only our abnormal fear of death, and the fact that we seemed to regard it as not only fearful but even evil, that forced us to attempt to prolong physical life. At any cost, it was especially valueless, since life, as we knew it, had little value or conscious purpose, even for those who were completely healthy, physically, and in no way threatened by disease or death. He was interested in the statistics concerning major diseases, the primary killers, and said that the prevalence of heart disease and cancer, for example, was proper to the kind of civilization we had produced and in which we had to live. These two diseases, along with lesser non-fatal ailments such as ulcers, were almost always the inevitable results of living in an unharmonious atmosphere under constant strain and pressure. Many of Gurdjieff's adherents were depressed by his often repeated flat statement that human beings could really learn and could still change only until they reached the age, usually in their early 20s, of a certain kind of maturity, the moment when they ceased to grow automatically. Once that point had been reached, life was nothing more than a kind of running down process, like the unwinding of a spring, and nothing new could be absorbed or learned. As many people had come to him long after reaching this maturity, they were not only depressed by this theory, but usually managed to interpret it to mean something entirely different, anything that would make it possible for them to have continued hope and feelings of encouragement. At one time, I commented on the fact that I had seen people at the Priory in various groups, and now again in New York, who seemed to me to interpret his ideas in such a way as to give themselves hope and a good feeling, and often managed by such interpretations to avoid the simple truth or fact that he was stating. He said that it was important not to be hard on people, that one could not begrudge them hope, and that if by this means they were able to continue with his teachings, they might somehow absorb something of value, if not for this life, then for the next. He also said that this tendency to interpret, to make his theories more digestible, was an indication of how greatly people felt a need for reassurance, direction, or learning of some kind, and that it was a need that should not be despised. He also said that while one individual might be able to influence in small ways a great many other individuals, in the final sense one man could only pass on the knowledge he had acquired to one other man, which was one of the great trials of teachers throughout his history. He also said that as one grew and learned in life, one came to know that one's own suffering was as nothing when compared with the necessity of having to watch the seemingly unnecessary suffering of others. In a sense, he said that the hardest trial of life was the inability to alleviate the suffering of others, and what made it worse was that most human suffering was valueless and that it never served a useful purpose, was never experienced consciously for a proper aim. Instead of using their suffering for the development of their higher consciousness, people spent all their time using every means they could find in an attempt to alleviate suffering that, in any case, could not be alleviated. He further said, and repeated it in his writings, that if individual men could ever learn to live with the constant knowledge and consciousness of the inevitability of their own personal death, they would already have achieved a great deal in the way of growth and of preparing themselves for real learning. But the sad fact, according to him, was that the state of our consciousness generally was such that this realization was actually impossible. In certain states to which men are subject, it is possible for them to long for death and an end to human life struggles, but this was a very different thing from the conscious acceptance of the implacable, undeniable inevitability of death for oneself. It was possible to envision the death of others, even those to whom one was greatly attached, but never our own. During that period in New York, I remember feeling strongly that while Gurdjieff, in an outer sense, seemed to me a prophet of doom and disaster and hopelessness, he nevertheless gave an effect of great encouragement and hope. When I spoke of this paradox to him, he reminded me that he had often told me to look at things upside down or from the other side of the coin, and that this very paradox, this stick with two ends, while a potentially dangerous thing, was also a very useful tool, and that it could give stimulus of such an order that one sometimes found energy and strength to work against odds that seemed impossible. He also said that any efforts of less than superhuman strength were of no value anyway, once more pointing out that, in a sense, man's only hope was to fight to attain the impossible, the only thing worth doing being something that could not be done.